Hi, I'm Richard Hundhausen. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to the Nexus, the framework for scaling Scrum. I'm going to tell you why we created it and how it can help your organization scale its software product delivery effectively. Now, having some working knowledge of Scrum and having read the current Scrum guide will be helpful as we explore the Nexus scaled Scrum framework. We created the Nexus to help identify and minimize dependencies, which become increasingly more abundant and critical at scale. Our guiding principle as we created the Nexus is that scaled Scrum is still Scrum. I think that this will be apparent as we wrap up our lesson by taking a walkthrough of the Nexus. But before we jump into the Nexus, let's first define what we mean by scaled Scrum. Take the following quadrant. On the bottom, we see the number of Scrum teams. The left column represents organizations or business groups who have one or two Scrum teams. The right column represents organizations with more than two Scrum teams. On the left are the number of products being developed. The bottom row represents a single product, and the top row represents multiple products. When a single team works on a single product, we only need to use Scrum. And this is exactly what Scrum was intended for. If we add a second team, in our opinion, does not become a scaling situation, as the two Scrum teams can coordinate easily enough throughout the day, handling any dependencies that might arise. When those one or two teams are working on multiple products, well, that can be painful, but common in many organizations that have more products than they do teams. If we increase the number of teams working on these multiple products, this becomes portfolio management. This is where management spends their time selecting and optimizing the people and the teams for these various product development efforts. This still is not scaling. When we have 3 or more Scrum teams working on a single product, this is scaled Scrum. It brings about a unique set of problems, which is what the Nexus Scaled Scrum framework addresses. Let me describe this in a different way. With a single Scrum team, working from a single product backlog, working in a single domain, things are complex, but still manageable. Well, when I say domain, I really mean a swamp, which is how most teams would describe their code base, their tests, or lack thereof, their tools, their automation, or lack thereof, etc., etc. Now, this cloud here represents a general inefficiency or waste due to handoffs, coordination, integration, rework, and even undone work and technical debt. It means that every sprint, the team will need to spend a portion of its time managing and organizing work, resolving dependencies, and working around this gunk, which is time not spent innovating. With 3 Scrum teams still working from a single product backlog and in a similar swamp, the inefficiency and waste due to dependencies grows at an alarming, nonlinear rate. In other words, a lot less time is available for product innovation. With 9 Scrum teams still working from a single product backlog and in a similar swamp, the inefficiency and waste due to the dependencies is almost suffocating. Without deliberate action, these teams, with their 40 to 80 individuals, will spend most of their time each sprint just staying out of each other's way. Product innovation will suffer, quality issues and technical debt will skyrocket. Before management decides to add another team, they really need to ask how much more value will be gained by doing so. Now, the goal of the Nexus Scaled Scrum framework is to scale the delivery of measurable business value as uniformly as possible, so that as your costs go up by adding more people, productivity should rise as close to the same rate as possible. Now that I've explained why we created it, let's take a look at the Nexus. The Nexus is a framework for developing and sustaining scaled product and software delivery initiatives. It uses Scrum as its building block. Much like Scrum, the framework consists of roles, events, and artifacts, as well as the rules that bind them all together. If you're familiar with the Scrum diagram, then you can't help but notice the similarities here. All of the roles, events, and artifacts are the same, but you probably noticed some additions as well. So let's begin our tour. In Scrum, product backlog refinement is optional, but in the Nexus it becomes an event, which means it's required. The number, frequency, duration, and attendance of the product backlog refinement is based on the dependencies and uncertainty inherent in the product backlog. The purpose of Nexus sprint planning is to coordinate the activities of all Scrum teams in a Nexus for the current sprint. The product owner provides domain knowledge and guides selection and priority decisions. The product backlog should be adequately refined, with dependencies identified and removed or minimized prior to this event. Now, during Nexus sprint planning, the appropriate representatives of each of the Scrum teams validate and make adjustments to the ordering of the work as created during those prior refinement events. Nexus sprint planning is complete when each Scrum team has finished their individual sprint planning events. A Nexus sprint backlog is simply the composite of all the product backlog items from all the individual Scrum team sprint backlogs. It's used to highlight dependencies and flow of work during the sprint. It's updated at least daily, often as part of the Nexus Daily Scrum. Speaking of the Nexus Daily Scrum, this is an event where the appropriate representatives from the individual development teams inspect the current state of the integrated increment and identify any integration issues or newly discovered cross-team dependencies or impacts. The development teams use the Nexus Daily Scrum to inspect progress towards the Nexus sprint goal. The individual Scrum teams then take back those issues and any work that was identified during the Nexus Daily Scrum to their individual Scrum teams for planning inside their individual Daily Scrum events. The Nexus Sprint Review is held at the end of the sprint to provide feedback on the integrated increment that the Nexus has built over that sprint and to adapt the product backlog if needed. The Nexus Sprint Review replaces individual Scrum Team Sprint Reviews because the entire integrated increment is the focus for capturing feedback from stakeholders. The Nexus Sprint Retrospective is a formal opportunity for a Nexus to inspect and adapt itself and create a plan for improvements to be enacted during the next sprint. This ensures continuous improvement. The Nexus Sprint Retrospective consists of 3 parts. The first part is an opportunity for appropriate representatives from each Scrum team to meet and make issues transparent to other teams. The second part consists of each Scrum team holding their own sprint retrospective as described in the Scrum framework. The individual Scrum teams should form any actions to address the shared issues. The third part is an opportunity for team representatives to come together again and agree on how to visualize and track the identified actions. This allows the Nexus as a whole to adapt and improve. Now let's take a look at a new role in the Nexus. While the Scrum team is responsible for delivering done increments of potentially releasable products, it's the Nexus integration team that's accountable for ensuring that a done integrated increment is produced at least once every sprint. So what does that mean? Well, integration includes resolving any technical or non-technical cross-team constraints that may impede the Nexus's ability to deliver a constantly integrated increment. Now, that doesn't mean that the Nexus integration team does the work. It's similar to the way a Scrum Master should coach and mentor and facilitate a Scrum team to resolve their own impediments rather than doing the work for them. So let's review. We've defined what scaling is and what it isn't. Hopefully this helps you understand whether or not you are in a scaling situation in your organization. As more teams and individuals are added, dependencies and integration issues become more abundant and can lead to waste if not managed. Nexus was created to raise the transparency of these dependencies and offer additional roles, events, and artifacts to mitigate them. And Nexus is still Scrum, so don't cast aside anything you've learned about Scrum through experience or reading the Scrum Guide, because it all still applies. So if you find yourself in an organization struggling to sequence the work across teams, suffering dependencies and suffering integration issues, consider descaling first. Remove the complexity and cost of the additional individuals and teams until you can maximize the business value being delivered. If you still need to scale, consider the Nexus framework. I hope this lesson has helped explain to you what the Nexus framework is, why we created it, and how it can help your organization deliver business value in the form of working software.